Well, hi there, folks. How are you all doing? My name is Eddie Ludlow. I'm the founder of the Whisky Lounge, along with my wife, Amanda, who is not with me today. But I will be taking you through this Asian whiskey tasting, which I'm sure you're very excited about, as we were when we were putting it together. Just to quickly check that you've got everything with you, and just to check you are here for the Asian whiskey tasting. Which should accompany the Asian whiskey tasting pack that hopefully you received for Christmas or whenever. Within it, you should find the 6 whiskies that we're going to be tasting today. A couple of other things, if you don't already have them, you should have some glassware. Now, not everyone keeps a few thousand of these knocking about, but these are Glencairn whiskey nosing glasses, which are specifically designed for tasting and nosing whiskey. As I say, not everyone has these. For me, they're a very good combination of the tulip-shaped bowl, which allows the aromas to be funneled into your nose, along with a slightly heavier base than a stemmed glass. However, if you don't have these, don't worry; it's not absolutely mandatory. So, if you've got something like a small wine glass, maybe 6 of those. It's quite important to use separate glasses so you can compare the whiskies to each other. Try not to drink them all in one go. Try and keep a little bit of each one as we go through so you can compare them. And they do change over the course of an hour or so, even longer as well. So it's always worth comparing and contrasting after 1 or 2 of the other whiskies. The other thing you might need to consider, or should want to consider, is water. Now, we at the Whisky Lounge, we do like to use water with whiskey, mainly because we find that it helps to break down some of the heavier components of the whiskies. It kind of balances some of them out to make them more acceptable to your palate, but it also creates more flavor in many whiskies, or rather uncovers flavors which are otherwise hidden by the very heavy alcohol molecules. So water can really aid in your quest to get as much analytical information out of each whiskey. Now, we would tend to prefer to use a spring water. So that's something that's very pure, doesn't contain too much in the way of minerals. So it's inert. So it's not going to affect the flavor of the whiskey, which, you've paid good money for. At the moment, we're using water from these guys, Larkfire, a really nice bunch of guys, actually Yorkshire based like us, but the water is bottled from the far north islands of Scotland and is perfect for adding to whiskey, and that's what we'll be using today here anyway. If you have to use tap water, if you can filter it, that would be better, but obviously it's going to contain things like fluoride and chlorine and so on, so it's not absolutely ideal. But if you've no other option, then please do use it, but filter it if you can. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a few slides on the screen just to help try and bring things to life a little bit, because not all of us have been to Asia, or all the parts of Asia that we're going to be talking about today. So it's always interesting to see where our whiskey is coming from. Now, the first of these is a slide just showing the countries that we're going to be looking at today. And here you have it. So you can see the 2 big circles, India and Japan, and then the smaller circle, you have Taiwan. These are the 3 countries we are most concerned with today. And to be honest, in terms of Asian whiskey, they would be the predominant producers of such liquid. Okay, come out of that again now. So what are we going to taste, and how are we going to taste it? Well, first of all, just in case you're new to whiskey, which there is nothing wrong with whatsoever, we were all new to whiskey at some point, just to reconfirm how whiskey is made. Whiskey is essentially distilled beer. Now, how do you get to that beer? Well, you take this stuff. So this is malted barley. You crush it down into a grist, which is this stuff, which is kind of like Alpen, or a kind of breakfast gran. And then you add lots and lots of water to it, hot water specifically. The hot water then explodes the sugars out of the malted barley, the crushed up malted barley, turns it into a sugary solution called wort. The wort has yeast added to it in the washbacks or fermentation tanks to some people. And this is what creates alcohol and creates the beer, normally between 7 and 9% ABV, which can taste pretty good sometimes, but it's not the final product when we're talking about whiskey, obviously. In order to make this beer into a whiskey, we need to distill it. So then we go to distillation, and it's at distillation where we separate the brewer from the distiller. And in distillation, essentially, we're looking to amplify the alcohol of the beer. And we do that by pushing the beer into the bottom of the still. The still acts as a giant copper kettle, essentially. And the wash bubbles up, boils away. And because of the lower boiling point of alcohol, the alcohol vapors start to lift off the liquid and travel to the top of the still and over the line arm and hit the condenser, which is basically a network of cold copper tubes. And the condenser recondenses the vapor into liquid, and this is then collected. It's collected the first time at around 25% alcohol ABV, which is obviously not quite strong enough, so we have to distill it once more. So this is a twice or double distillation. In the second set of stills, or the second still, we will distill it again and recondense it again, and at this point it's between 65 and 70% alcohol. Now the middle cut is drawn from this second distillation, and the middle cut, the best way to describe it is basically the heart of the run. So we take the first part of the distillation, so the heads, if you like, which contain very heavy alcohols and stuff that really is not very good for you or tastes very good. So we park that, if you like, and then we start taking the heart of the distillation, and then we end up with the tails, which again contains unwanted residue, if you like, from the bottom of the still. And this again is parked along with the heads, and both of those are reserved to be distilled once again. So it's all kind of recycled, if you like. It's an ongoing batch process. Now the heart, or the middle cut, is then generally reduced down to 63.5% alcohol, which is a kind of industry normal, and then put into the cask of choice of that distiller. So whatever the distiller has chosen to use as a vessel for maturation. And this may vary from country to country. In Scotland, it would tend to be ex-bourbon American oak casks would be the favoured cask of most, although obviously you see ex-sherry, ex-port, and so on and so forth. And that's mirrored across most countries that make single malt, although there are regional differences, which we can talk about a little bit later. Okay, so we're going to talk about the first whiskey just now. And in your pack, you should notice the order from left to right. So the first whiskey we're going to taste is here. And this is the Suntory Cheetah. Now, Suntory, you may know or may have heard of, was made very famous by the Bill Murray film Lost in Translation, where he was advertising actor for Suntory, advertising Hibiki, 17-year-old. Things have moved on quite a bit since then. Age statements seem to have disappeared from Japanese whiskey quite some time ago, mainly because of the extreme popularity for Japanese whiskey, and therefore there's a scarcity to Japanese whiskey now. The Chita is actually produced at Suntory's grain distillery of the same name. Now I'm just going to bring up a slide to show you what this looks like. First of all, I'll show you where Chita is in terms of in terms of Japan. So you can see it is just down here at Nagoya Port, which is southwest of Tokyo on the main island. Now, Chita was actually Suntory's second distillery. So Yamazaki was the first in 1923. So can you believe we're going to be talking about 100 years of purpose-built Japanese whiskey distilleries in just a couple of years. Chita was opened in 1972 with Hakushu, their second malt distillery, in 73. Now, the grain distillery Chita was built in order to supply Suntory with grain whiskey, which they could then use to produce blended Japanese whiskies, similar to blended Scotch whiskies. Now, in Japan, there is no cask trading between whiskey companies. So Suntory and Nikka, the two biggest companies, currently don't trade casks, which is quite unusual compared to, say, Scotland. In Scotland, trading casks is the lifeblood of the Scotch blended industry. Most distilleries in Scotland are much smaller facilities than the giant facilities from Nikka and Suntory, and therefore they produce a very specific style of whiskey. So to blend just one distillery's whiskies is, it's not really going to be any great shakes. So in Scotland, they developed an industry where distilleries would swap casks in order to be able to produce their own blended Scotch whiskey. But that just never happened in Japan for various reasons. So instead of trading casks, what the Japanese producers, particularly Nikka and Suntory, did was build distilleries that could produce a multitude of styles of single malt whiskies to be then blended with their own grain whiskey. So originally the idea behind Chita was to produce this grain whiskey to go along with the varying styles that they were producing at Yamazaki and Hakushu. And so this is a single grain whiskey. It's not the same, obviously, as single malt whiskey. It's produced in quite a different fashion. You can see on the image on the right-hand side, that's the image of the stills, which are actually outdoors because, frankly, they're too big to be put indoors. And these are giant column stills, which are a very much more effective way of distilling, essentially using a network of copper platelets, which act as distilling plates and allow for this kind of continuous distillation and purity of the spirit. Now, I would certainly recommend you look up column distillation or continuous distillation on your favorite search engine and have a little look, because it's worth getting to understand how it works, even from a rudimentary point of view. You'll notice that they use corn, which is quite old-fashioned these days. Most grain distillers in Scotland would use wheat, and corn would predominantly be used in the USA for bourbon and the like. But it's a nice ingredient for grain whiskey. For me, it gives a little bit more body, a bit more oiliness, perhaps, than wheat. And so the Chita here, I'm going to taste. I've poured myself a little bit already. Let me just come out of that for a second. Okay, so I'm going to give it a little swirl around in the glass at first. Now, Cheetah's bottled at 43% alcohol, so it's 3% above the minimum, 40% being the minimum for it to be allowed to be called whiskey. I'm going to start nosing it. Now, you saw there, I stuck my nose straight in. That's because my senses are fairly well adapted to smelling and tasting whiskey. What you might want to do is hold the glass a few inches below your nose to begin with, and then bring your glass to your nose, and then eventually you want to get your nose into the glass. But you don't need to sniff hard. Whiskey is even the gentlest of whiskies are quite strong in flavour, and they need to give them a little bit of a wide berth, give them some respect. But with these tastings, what we try to do is ensure that we start with the lightest whiskies and end with the slightly heavier whiskies, so that we're building up our palate, and we're also giving each of the whiskies a chance. If you put this whiskey that we're going to taste now at the very end, it would probably suffer from the more robust whiskies that we're going to taste further down the line. Okay, so having had a little nose of it, now I'm going to taste it at full strength without adding water, because for me, some whiskies taste better at full strength, as simple as that. We have to balance this situation up, because obviously we want to get as much information from the whiskey as possible, but we also want to understand which of the whiskies we might want to buy in the future. And certainly, when I'm at home, I don't always add water to whiskey. And whiskey for me quite often is about the very intense heat and flavor that you get from whiskey. And sometimes when you add water to it, it does lose some of that intensity. So for me, in these tastings, it's really important to taste without water first, and then we can add a little bit of water and see what happens then. So let's give it a taste. Okay, so how do you find that? Is it sweet? Is it sour? Is it bitter? Is it dry? For me, it's sweet. It's very slightly spicy. I'm not getting any particular pronounced flavors, maybe kind of burnt caramel or vanilla. It's very subtle. Now I'm going to add a bit of water to this to see if we can eke some more flavors out of this. So I'm going to show you how much water I'll add. Just a few drops to begin with. Now remember, when you're adding water to whiskey, you can't extract it once you've put it in, as I've learned from bitter experience. So the best thing to do is try a few drops at once. And then if you find you need to add a little bit more, you can keep adding water to it until you get to the point you're happy with. But do it in small gradients, because you'll soon end up with whiskey cordial, which is obviously not what you're wanting in this exercise. Anyway, let's see what those few drops of water have done to this. Okay, so I'm definitely getting a little bit more citrus fruit, maybe a bit of banana peel. A little bit of boiled sweet. It's definitely, I feel, has given it a bit more balance. Let's give it a taste. Yeah, I think the water has definitely just brought an overall more balanced feel, both to the nose and the palate of the Cheetah. But what do you think? Don't be afraid about adding water, or even if you don't want to add water, it's fine. I can only give you my give you my experience of having tried many whiskies in many different fashions. So give it a try, and don't let anyone tell you how you should or shouldn't enjoy your whiskey. By the way, ultimately, it's your whiskey. You do what you want with it. Yeah. Okay. So I think that was a nice start. It's what I would call a kind of breakfast whiskey, the Cheetah. Very light in style, and maybe more of an aperitif. I don't actually drink whiskey for breakfast, just to reassure you. Well, not all the time. Anyway, moving on. Okay, so we're going to go to the next whiskey, which is another Japanese whiskey. Let's put the Cheetah back here. So this whiskey is from Nikka Distillers, or Nikka Whiskey. and is the Miyagikyo, which is Nikka's second distillery in Japan. The first was Yoichi, which was founded by, well, both were founded by Masataka Takatsuru, who is often monikered the godfather of Japanese whiskey, alongside perhaps Shinjiro Tori, who established Yamazaki with Masataka back in 1923. Unfortunately, the two of them fell out. Masataka, I mean, his story is fascinating, and again, I would urge you to look him up on Google or other search engines and look for his story. Masataka Takatsuru, who basically talked a sake producing businessman who he had gone to work for into sending him to Scotland to go and learn about making whiskey, which is what he really wanted to do, even though he came from a sake producing family himself. And he spent a good couple of years traveling around Scotland, mainly based in Glasgow, but then going off into Speyside to Campbelltown and so on, and working for weeks at a time at different distilleries in Scotland, and just learning how to make whiskey the Scottish way, single malt whiskey, that is. And then, so by the time he got back to Japan, and he took a Scottish wife back with him, who he married while he was over here. You know, he'd picked up all this knowledge, made all the notes, and he was ready to go. Unfortunately, the chap who originally sent him to Japan, his priorities had shifted. Business had not been going quite as well in Masataka's absence. But fortunately, he linked up with Shinjiro Tori, who was doing very well and was ready to build a distillery, and that distillery was Yamazaki. And so the two of them, with Shinjiro's business nous and Masataka's knowledge of distillation and how a distillery should be set up, as well as run, the two of them set about creating the first purpose-built whiskey distillery in Japan, which was Yamazaki. Now, they fell out at some stage. Masataka always wanted to build the distillery in the North Island, Hokkaido, because he felt that was where the most sympathetic landscape and topography was for making Japanese whiskey. So eventually, when the two parted ways, he took Rita with him to Hokkaido and built the Yoichi distillery, and that was in 1939. And this was the distillery of his dreams, you know, direct fired stills, etc., in a, you know, very kind of mountainous setting, like the Highlands of Scotland, as he saw it. And yeah, it was. And Yoichi is, you know, quite infamous for its fabulous single malt whiskies. If you can get hold of the 10, 15, 20-year-old Yoichis, you'd be lucky these days, but some of them are just absolutely fabulous stuff. But in 1969, not too far off the same time that the Suntory guys decided that they needed a second distillery, because Japanese whiskey was starting to really become popular domestically. And so he built the Miyagikyo distillery at Sendai. Let me just get this slide up for you so you can see what I'm talking about. First of all, we can show you the map so you can see where Miyagikyo is kind of north of on the main island there. And then we're going to move to the slide here where you can actually see Miyagikyo is quite a forest setting. That looks absolutely gorgeous, doesn't it? And then on the right you can see some of the stills at Sendai, Miyagikyo. Now, as well as the pot stills that they were obviously going to install in this distillery, they also had decided they were going to build column stills into the build as well, because like Suntory, they wanted to create a blended Japanese whiskey, but like Suntory, they're not trading casks either. So we're very reliant upon their own machinations, if you like, for producing these different styles. And so Miyagikyo, particularly like Hakushu of Suntory, was built as a distillery of all trades, if you like. So different shapes and styles of still, in order to create different weights and styles of spirits, of whiskies, to try and, if you like, mimic what the effect of using different makes from different distilleries in Scotland has on a Scotch whiskey blend. So a really, really clever innovation, and actually something that latterly Scotch distillers have actually taken note of, and particularly Diageo. You know, they have their distillery up north at Roseisle, in which they have a very similar pattern, in which they have different pairs of stills in different shapes and sizes, producing different weights and styles of whiskey, of spirit. So it's quite ironic in a way that this, you know, the Scotch obviously had a massive influence on the Japanese, and there's actually some give and take between them now in terms of sharing of information. Now you can see that they're mainly using ex-bourbon. I mean, we'll see this as a pattern pretty much throughout this whole tasting, but ex-bourbon, various wine and sherry casks, occasional use of Japanese Mizunara oak. I say occasional because it's not a sustainable source. It's quite rare nowadays, so it's not used as often in whiskey production as any of us would like, because Mizunara can have a lovely effect on whiskey being matured, very sort of perfumed, aromatic note, which is not present necessarily in American or European oak. Anyway, let's go to the tasting. Okay, so got your glass of Miyagikyo, and as I said earlier on, I think, you know, that with regards to age statements, there's no age stated on Miyagikyo at the moment, as I said, because the stocks of Japanese whiskey in general in the warehouses in Japan have been depleted so much because of the popularity of the stuff that currently they're having to play catch up. So they're having to release whiskies with no age statement, so that they can be a little bit more creative with their blending, without necessarily the label saying, you know, this contains 5 or 6 year old whiskies in it, which it may well. In reality, I would imagine the youngest whiskey in there is very 7 or 8 years old, maybe the oldest being 12 years old. So it's probably close to 9-10 years old on average. But let's give it a taste anyway. So this is bottled at 45% ABV. Now, what you might notice actually is a light peated note, so a slight smokiness about it. And there is a little bit of peated whiskey that's made its way into there. So they do, both at Yoichi, they would use more peated barley than in Miyagikyo, but they also would use peated barley in Miyagikyo. And even just that little sprinkling of it really brings that to life, gives it a lovely balance. So there's beautiful sweetness about it, but it's kept in check by the very light smokiness. Yeah, I'm going to add a little bit of water to mine, even though I think it tastes absolutely delicious at full strength. I just want to see if we can get any more flavor information out of it. I get some kind of smoky boiled sweets now. A bit of apple tart. a little bit of cinnamon or star anise or something. Don't worry if you don't get any of these flavors that I start spouting. This is just, it's just, I suppose when you've been tasting whiskey for so many years, you've got to think of something to say. Hey? But sometimes these flavors, because you've been tasting whiskey for so long, they just kind of come to you, and they start to remind you of other whiskeys you've tasted. And don't be afraid to use tasting notes to describe the flavors that you're smelling or tasting in the whiskeys. There's nothing to be embarrassed about. Anyway, let's give it a taste of that's slightly diluted. Yeah, that's very good. So the Miyagikyo you can buy still is around 75 quid a bottle. Chita, the Cheetah is slightly cheaper. It's around 50 quid a bottle, but both are available in good specialist retailers like the Whisky Exchange, Master of Malt, House of Malt, Royal Malt Whiskies, all those kinds of guys. They're pretty widely available, which is good news. What would be even better news is when we can finally see some of the different age statements coming back, which just brings color to any whiskey lover's life. But I hope you enjoyed that Miyagikyo. Okay, so we're going to move country now. We're going to move slightly to the west and slightly to the south, and we're going to Taiwan. Let me see if I can find the Taiwanese slide. Oops. Here we go. So there you can see Taiwan, and you can see Kavalan Distillery on the northeast, not quite the tip of Taiwan, but it's about an hour and a half drive from the main city of Taipei, in Yunnan County. Kavalan, named after the Kavalan tribe, which was a indigenous tribe that would be very dominant in the area. And Kavalan itself it feels like it's been around for a long time now, but it was established in 2005 with production starting in 2006. So it's not even really been 15 years, but they've established themselves super quick. And to be honest, I have no problem with that whatsoever, because the whiskies that come from Kavalan that I've tasted have been generally superb. On a par with the best of Japanese and Scottish and elsewhere. So it's no surprise really that that time has just flown by. Now the whiskey we're going to taste is the Sherry Oak Kavalan, which is around 95 quid a bottle. It's not cheap, and none of the Kavalans are cheap, to be honest. But it definitely is a question of you get what you pay for. And I think when you taste this, you'll understand, where that money is going into. And they don't do anything by halves. Everything has to be of the best quality, whether it's the distilling equipment, the team, the staff, to the casks themselves, which they look after in their own cooperage, and the cask they buy are only of the best quality. And as you can see from the slide, quite interesting. Malted barley is imported from Europe. I mean, Taiwan as a country is pretty small, being where it is. Its main grain production would be rice, and therefore there's not a great deal of room or space left over for producing the likes of barley. Not to mention it's not necessarily wouldn't necessarily be the best crop to be growing in such a humid, hot climate, subtropical climate. Now, when we come to places like Taiwan, and then again when we come to India, Japan's climate is generally cool, temperate, like that of Europe and the UK. And as you go further north into Hokkaido, it becomes colder and colder. But even in the central of the main island, it's not super hot during the year. Whereas in Taiwan, you have the subtropical climate. You're a bit further south, which gives it much more humidity and a much higher average temperature throughout the year. It means that in the warehouses of Kavalan, the temperatures get well above 30, closer to 40 for much of the summer, which produces this kind of rate of super maturation. So it matures the whiskey in a much accelerated rate. So as we'll see from the Indian whiskies as well, this Kavalan is only around 4 years old. Okay. Now, if I said to myself 10, 15 years ago, you're going to be drinking 4-year-old Taiwanese whiskey in 10, 15 years' time, I perhaps would have said, don't be mad. That's simply not going to happen. But let's taste it and see what it's like. Does that smell like a 4-year-old single malt whiskey to you? Wow. I mean, it's a big difference from the Miyagikyo style-wise. Obviously, it's a lot more oak being displayed, a lot more wood influence, which you'd kind of expect because of the sherry oak moniker. But you've got a dual effect going on there. You've got the fact that the oak, the wood that this has gone to, is clearly more vociferous, more active. But also you've got the climate factor going on as well. So you've got this really, really aggressive maturation in what is, quite an aggressive cask type, which is producing this incredible result in that short space of time. Now, I don't expect all of you to like it as much as the Miyagikyo, for example. And I'm certainly not saying one is better than the other. They're clearly quite different and doing different jobs. But this just, for me, shows what can be achieved in such a short space of time in Taiwan at Kavalan Distillery. I'm going to add a touch of water to it. Now, I would always advise with sherry cask whiskies to just be a little bit wary of water. They don't tend to react quite as well as ex-bourbon cask whiskies. But let's just give it a try anyway. It's calmed it down a little bit. I think it's lost some of its intensity, which I really enjoyed, but still good. It is a very robust style. And as I say, I don't expect everyone to like it quite so much. Some people really don't like that sherry cask style of whiskey. And don't be afraid if you don't like it. Don't let anyone intimidate you into liking it, because ultimately it's up to you and your palate what you like. And this is why, for me, whiskey is such a fascinating subject, because everyone does have individual tastes, and which is why we have so many different whiskies. If everyone had the same taste, there would be no need to produce so many different types of whiskey. And how boring would that be? Okay, I hope you enjoyed that Kavalan anyway. Okay, so we're gonna move on to our trio from India, which is really exciting. And we're going to start with a distillery that I'm not as familiar with as the other two, but I've come to enjoy it over the last few months. So this is Rampur Distillery and the double cask bottling. And now let me see. Okay. And let me just bring up the map again so you can see where these distilleries there we go. So you should be able to see Rampu Distillery, John Distillers, and Amrut Distillery on there. So these are the three distilleries we're about to taste. So Rampur, right up there in the north of India. Unfortunately, never been to India myself, but looking forward to one day going to explore some of these lovely, beautiful areas. But the Rampur Distillery was established in 1943. Radiko Kaitan, it was previously called, and it's often still referred to as. And it was, I mean, you can see on the left-hand photo, it's a big network of industrial buildings, and essentially was built unashamedly as a neutral alcohol production facility, producing industrial alcohol. But then the founders had an interest in whiskey and wanted to, as they could, start to make single malt whiskies. So they had single malt or malt copper pot stills installed, as you can see on the right hand side, and started making single malt whiskey in 1994. They also used the indigenous Indian 6-row barley, which is quite different to 2-row barley that you would find in Europe and Scotland and England and so on, in that the 6 rows means that the seeds are much more tightly packed, which means that they're kind of jostling for space, and it makes the skin of the seed a lot thicker, the husk, if you like, and that it produces quite a different flavor to 2-row barley. And in fact, all 3 of the Indian whiskies we're going to taste use that 6-row barley, albeit the Paul John will use peated barley from Scotland and Europe, which would be 2-row. And again, mainly ex-bourbon, with various wine and sherry casks also used. So these guys, Rampur, are pretty new to the market. Although they've a lot of distillation experience, they don't have a huge amount of experience in producing single malt whiskey. And it's only in the last couple of years where we've seen Rampur being sold on the European market. And this is their double cask, which is a combination of ex-bourbon and European sherry oak casks. I think Oloroso. I'm pretty sure it's Oloroso. And let's see what we think of this. I obviously have tried this a little bit earlier in the year, back in October. I seem to remember being quite impressed. Now, first of all, I get a bit of a farmyard hint of it, which is not a bad thing whatsoever. And I was doing another video yesterday about English whiskies and finding that farmyard aroma of them as well. But that for me is probably more to do with the barley itself. You're just smelling more of the cereal, which might remind you of the farm. And certainly a lot of the comments I've read about Rampur is that you can taste more of the distillate character, which is along the lines of kind of tropical fruits and sweet, luscious flavors. So let's give it a taste. And this is bottled at 45% non-chill filtered, which is all good. Not bad at all. It's got sweetness, it's got a slight spiciness. It's not overly sweet. I certainly can get a bit of kind of burnt pineapple or something. I'm going to add a little bit of water, see if I can identify a few more flavors out of it. Yeah, I think a little bit of water is the way to go with this one. Very good. I mean, this is a business that has only really been making malt whiskey for a few years, so it's a good effort. Again, we were talking about in Kavalan in Taiwan, this heat and humidity and the effect it has on whiskey maturation, and it's the same for these three distilleries we're going to be tasting here. So Rampur in the very north of India, temperature ranges from, I believe it's 1 degree in the winter to 46 degrees centigrade in the summer in the warehouse, which is just staggering to think about. I don't think I could survive in that. But it means you get this hyper maturation. But it as much of an advantage as it is for all of these distilleries, it does mean that very rarely will you see an age statement on any of their whiskies, because they simply cannot age their whiskies beyond a certain point. So they have to keep a real close eye on them. I think at Paul John, for example, the Angel's share is around 10% per year. So the Angel's share describes the evaporation from the cask. Every year it will lose a certain amount of alcohol and liquid volume. Whereas in Scotland, that is, and it's normally around 1.5% of each in Scotland. In India, in Goa, we'll just quickly talk about Paul John, you're looking around 10% Angel share. The alcohol increases because of the heat, but the evaporation is much faster. And so by the time you get to 4 or 5 years old, you've lost 3 or 4 times that of what you would have lost in Scotland. So it's incredibly, it's a juggling act, and it does mean that age statements are something you won't generally see, particularly with Indian and Taiwanese whiskies, or those whiskies made in warmer climates. Anyway, what did you think of the Rampur? Did you like it? I think it's a really good, solid first attempt, and I'll be glad to drink some more, and I might do later on. Anyway, next we're going to move on to the Paul John. So this is the Paul John edited, which is a slightly peated version of Paul John. Let's bring up the slide so we can see. There we go. So we'll go back to the slide with the map, and you can see Paul John on the west coast in Goa, just outside Goa, which I believe is absolutely gorgeous, and the beaches of Goa are supposed to be sensational. I'm looking forward to one day making it across there. And so Paul John was the youngest of these three distilleries in terms of its entrance into the UK market, as you can see there. But in fact, in terms of the age of the distillery, it is the youngest. So 1996, it was established with single malt production since 2008. So it's probably the least experienced in some ways. But again, like Kavalan, in a way, they have established themselves pretty quickly, using a very traditional method of distillation, as you can see there, using the 6-row unpeated barley plus peated Scottish or European barley, and similar maturation regime using mainly ex-bourbon. But then when we smell things like the Paul John, this edited, Amrut do a peated variant as well. And it's very, very good. But I think for me, Paul John, personally, I think Paul John is at its best in the peated variant, whereas Amrut, I think, is at its best in its unpeated variant. But that may change from day to day. But that's that's currently the way I feel about it. And it's bottled at 46%. So it's a nice strength. It means we can add water to it nicely without worrying about it too much. It means it's unchill filtered, which essentially means that it hasn't been filtered at the point of prior to bottling, which means essentially it has to be bottled at 46%. If it's not chill filtered, it leaves fatty acids and lipids behind, which to my mind and to many people leads to a much oilier kind of viscous mouthfeel and when you swallow it. Some people entirely disagree with this, but that's it's individual taste, and I certainly feel it is the case. However, if you leave those fatty acids and lipids within the liquid, you risk you run the risk of it throwing a haze, so you end up with a cloudy solution in the bottle along with the whiskey, which doesn't look the most attractive. So you have to bottle it at a slightly higher strength, which kind of keeps those lipids in stasis and ensures the clarity of the final product. But it only does so at 46% or above. If it drops below that, then particularly in cold temperatures, you'll find that whiskey throws a haze. So if you see 46% on a bottle, it's generally a good thing. 46% or more. So anyway, let's give this a nose. So as I said before, this is a combination of peated and unpeated single malt from the same distillery to produce a lightly peated dram. So you want, similarly to the Miyagikyo, hopefully we'll find something that's just balanced by the smoke rather than dominated by it. It's really lovely. What I tend to find with Paul John peated whiskies particularly is this kind of minty eucalyptus characteristic, which I often find in older Islay whiskies like Kalila and Ardbeg. And I think it's really attractive. It's something I really, really like. But that could be just me. So I've added a little bit of water to the Paul John. I think it's bringing out more of that smoky mintiness that I was mentioning earlier on. I'd be interested to see what you think about that. I definitely get it. That's a really, really lovely dram. No complaints about that. I'm trying to think. I think possibly I prefer it at full strength. It's very nice with the addition of water, and maybe I prefer the nose, but I think on the palate I prefer it at full strength. So I think for later I might be leaving it at 46%. But what do you think? What's your comments on the Paul John edited? Price wise, the Rampur is around, I think it's around 45 quid, and the Paul John around 40, 42 quid. So, they're very good value for what they are, I think. I would have no complaints. I mean, these days, 40, 45 quid doesn't get you a huge amount in terms of Scotch single malt anymore. So I think they're a really good price. Okay, so we're on to our final whiskey. Can you believe it already? Obviously, you can pause this video anytime you like if you want to just take your time a little bit more, and I hope I'm not going too fast for you. But it feels like a good pace. So the final whiskey we're going to taste is from the Indian distillery, which has been in our consciousnesses for a lot longer than the other two, and a distillery that I'm very fond of. We worked quite heavily with Amrut when they first brought the product to the UK. We were very proud to be associated with them and with the first Indian single malt whiskey. So we still have very fond memories of all of that, and we'd love to see what they come up with next. And this is something quite unusual, quite different. But let me just bring back the presentation just to have a look to see where Amrut is. So there you should see on that presentation slide. So Amrut is the most furthest south of the three, down in Bangalore, kind of middle south. I wish I knew India more, but that's where it is. And there's the distillery itself. It's not the most attractive of buildings from the outside. Post-war building, founded in 1948. But malt whiskey production only started in 1987. So up to that point, they were really concerned with producing molasses-based products and neutral alcohols and so on, that kind of thing. And then they decided in the 80s that they wanted to start to produce single malt whiskey. But it wasn't really until the early 2000s when the grandson of the original founder, Mr. Jagdale, was commissioned to, was based in Newcastle upon Tyne, University of Newcastle upon Tyne, and was commissioned by his family to do a report on the viability of selling Amrut into other nations other than India, because it wasn't doing well in India. In India, certainly back then, and still to a degree now, it's all about blended whiskey and blended Scotch whiskey, Johnny Walker and so on. They didn't want Indian single malt whiskey, so they wanted to find markets for it. So he did this study on the viability of selling Indian single malt whiskey into the US, to Europe, and so on. So eventually they launched in 2004, I think it was, in the UK, and haven't looked back. I mean, they've done so well, and they're so highly in demand. It's great to see, highly deserved. The whiskies are generally very interesting. I mean, a staple of mine is the Amrut Fusion, which is, I think it's still about 55 quid a bottle, something like that. And it's just one of those whiskies you can drink as a session whiskey with no problem whatsoever. Just delicious. Similarly to the edited Paul John, this combination of unpeated and peated, which for me gives it a very nice balance. This is a very interesting whiskey in that it has been matured, first of all, 3 years in ex-bourbon, but then they've taken sherry casks, they've two back to Bangalore, then filled them with sherry, but also with orange peel, locally grown orange peel, and then seasoned those casks with this mixture for 3 years. They then emptied it of this liquid, put this 3-year-old Amrut into the casks, and matured that for another 3 years. So roughly 6 years old. And they call it Amrut Naarangi. This is it here. Now this is about 140 quid a bottle, I think. So this is not cheap by any stretch of the imagination, but I thought, it might be fun to have something a little bit esoteric. And this is bottled at 50% alcohol, which actually there's quite a few Amruts bottled at 50%. It seems to be almost their signature strength. I mean, you certainly, I don't know if it's just the clever marketing and label and so on, but I'm definitely getting a bit of orange zest and flavoring coming through. Let's have a taste. There is definitely that orange influence there, but it's got a really lovely intensity about it, which I think is as much to do with the spirit quality as it is about those crazy casks. You definitely get that sort of orange peel tannin on the back of the tongue. It's not unpleasant at all. Right, I've added a little bit of water to that. Pretty good with the water as well. I think probably on balance, I don't know. I was going to say I preferred it without water, but I'm not 100% sure now because that was tasting good too. But anyway, good stuff. Okay, well, listen, I hope you've enjoyed the tasting. I certainly have. As you've seen, I've been tasting along with you so that you don't feel like you're drinking alone. We wouldn't want that at all. But I hope you've enjoyed it, and please do call back and taste some more things with us. We do have plenty of other tasting packs, and we will be having more and more next year, so keep an eye out for those. We do appreciate your support, and it's been lovely sharing these whiskies with you. But for now, I'm going to say goodbye, and thank you very much. Bye-bye.